The French let us down, the Italians let us down. But, so I don't know what any Africans or whatever wanted to be in it for, you know.
1939, led by Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany embarked on a rampage of greed and brutality. By 1940, their armies had marched into almost every country in Europe and taken them over. Only Britain was left to oppose them. Hitler was determined to destroy this last obstacle. His navy set up blockades in the Atlantic. At the same time, he sent his massive air force, the Luftwaffe, to bomb Britain.
Soon the nightly Battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight. They'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people. Probably some of the people you are watching now.
Thousands of people, both civilians and servicemen and women, were killed. Cities and industries were devastated. Fear gripped the land. Close to collapse, Britain was forced to turn overseas for help to her colonies. Many of us now do not know or choose to forget that Britain once had an empire. These were the countries scattered around the world that Britain herself had conquered and now flew the British flag. Before the war, the social order throughout the empire hadn't changed a great deal. The British West Indies were ruled by a white colonial administration, which largely excluded the black population.
In the late 30s, just before the war broke out, times were quite hard in the Caribbean. There had been a number of riots across the Caribbean in 1937 because food was expensive, jobs were scarce. So people had actually kind of gone to the streets and complained, literally, about it. But also it's quite hard because basically most of the jobs in the Caribbean were reserved for the colonials. And then the people who were there just got the kind of the leftovers. So lots of manual labor, but the manual labor didn't pay very well.
That's what we are doing. That's true.
It was very hard in Jamaica. We couldn't get a lot of things because the war. No ship couldn't bring things home. So we depend on exporting things that come into us. So we couldn't get a lot of things. So it was very hard, very hard.
Not only Jamaica alone, during the war we had a lot of other West Indian islands involved with conflicts, and that went on for quite some time. For instance, there was a lot of class distinction, I would say, with the working class and the upper class.
In Jamaica, as far as I can remember, you have the Europeans. They were the ones under the old colonial system. They were in charge, and then you have the Jamaicans that were privileged. That's the upper class Jamaican, and you got the middle class Jamaican, and then you got the ordinary Jamaican, and that was the setup.
I think he had a very lovely childhood, actually. Playing piano, and his mum was teaching piano, and he was very close to his brothers and sisters.
His dad was a Moravian minister, and they lived next door to the church, and they had a very privileged, as you said, background with servants, and they did have stuff. They did.
Yeah.
There was also a political consciousness growing. And certainly in Jamaica, just before the war, there were strikes, there was agitation.
The white colonials were controlling the country during that time. I mean, if you wanted something to progress in your life, you had to approach them first.
As far as England was concerned, in the Caribbean, England was revered, looked up to, adored, admired, because all the people in the Caribbean were taught from an English curriculum. So they were taught to sing God Save the Queen. The subjects you were taught in school, you'd be taught about Wordsworth and Shakespeare, and basically the people in the Caribbean saw England as their mother country, literally.
He was incredibly proud of his black roots and angry as a young man that he was never taught black history as a child. You know, he was sort of couldn't figure out why he was learning about Oliver Cromwell and all the wives of Henry VIII.
Well, somebody said to me, in some cases we were more English than the English.
Up until the war, English culture had not changed a great deal since Victorian times. It was not the multicultural society we know today.
And I was born at Hurstbeer Point in West Sussex, which is not very, very far from here. It's only a small little town, really. But I didn't stay there very long because our family moved to a little village called Long Ditton, which is in Surrey. And this was out in the country. I suppose really the best way of describing it was rather idyllic. We were free, easy, front doors weren't locked.
Up the top there. Third one up. Third one along up the top.
My name's Ron. I come from Peckham in London. I haven't moved into it. We didn't have a lot of money or anything like that, but we got along with wrestling, etc.
Being English, yes, I suppose the fact was when we were brought up, everything was English. We had English meals at home. We led a more English life than we would, say, a British life.
I've lived in Dulwich and I've worked in Dulwich. I went to school in Dulwich. 91 years. This is now.
Yeah, I met a few coloured people, not many, because there obviously wasn't the ethnic background then that there is now. They were no different than anybody else.
When I was a boy, we only saw basically two coloured people. One was an Indian with a turban, by goodness gracious meat man, who used to come round and sell scarves and silk ties. He used to come round once a year. And you know, and it was all good part of the fun of growing up. And the other man was a big black Negro who was, I can't remember, I think we nicknamed him Cherry Blossom. Wouldn't do today, but he came round and he was a tipster for horse racing. They were the only two coloured people we used to see as a youngster. I must admit, I hadn't really known of any accents except the one that we normally spoke where we lived. Living out in the country, things were very stable. People didn't move about. You knew your neighbours knew you, and there was much more friendly atmosphere. It was good living in those days.
This country is at war with Germany. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part.
Britain launched a desperate appeal for volunteers to join the war effort. Notices and recruitment centres were sent out to the West Indies and the African colonies of the Empire.
Back in 1943, Britain was struggling in the war, and Churchill advertised in the Jamaican Cleaner, and they desperately need manpower to come and serve in the forces. And they decided to ask people to join the Royal Air Force in Jamaica. And surprisingly, I read the Gleaner that week, and I went past the queue for some unknown reason and went straight in, and I became the 39th man to join the Royal Air Force. And within a couple of days, I went home back to my mother and told her I was out on a ship to England. I knew nothing about England, and I heard the call.
More than 16,000 young men and women from the Caribbean heard the call and signed up. They had many reasons for volunteering their services.
When I was 18, I volunteered for the Royal Air Force. And my mother said, son, the mother country is at war, go. And if you live, it would be a good thing. She was right. Let us get this straight. The Germans wanted to rule the world. And if they had won, they put a few people in ovens and light the fire, they would do almost the same to us. So it was a good thing to fight for our own salvation.
Guyana is not the place you want to make a living, and England was calling, and to join the RAF was what these people, the guys did.
Yeah, I think it was his ticket out of Guyana, really.
That's what you said.
Family wasn't rich enough to send me abroad to study, and I just wanted to go together. My parents didn't know I was in the Air Force until I left.
My parents had ideas. I had my own ideas because as a kid I used to, my father was a role model to me, and his uniform and his importance. I said to myself, well, that is my life, but he didn't want me to do that. My father was the skipper of the Inter-Island cargo ship. He was the first black skipper, because the skippers are always Europeans, but he was the first one to break through.
Well, I'm from Sierra Leone. I have two heads. My father is from Sierra Leone, my mother is from Nigeria. What they did was to actually come to the schools and they look for everybody that is above a certain particular standard. You know how to read geometry, algebra, English, and you must get your certificate of all those kind of things. I had to join the West African Air Corps, and it was from there they started to see how they can recruit us to become members, and we were trained. What they did was they look at people who can actually be trained to be pilots. Because in Sierra Leone, all they did was they recruited for pilots and engineers.
Why do we want to join the Air Force? And a lot of us were waiting outside, and as somebody comes and said, what did they ask you? Why you want to join? What did you say? So the general thing was, we want to defend king and country. At that time, England had a king. So when I went in, he come and said, why do you want to join the Air Force? To defend king and country, sir, or miss whoever it did. And that was it, really, of course.
In 1941, I went in the army. I mean, and all they did was call you up by a letter through the door and a train ticket to report to wherever. I wasn't conscripted, I was called up. Because if you were conscripted, that was for 3 years. You didn't know when you were going to come out when I went in. All right, I was there and scare them then.
A lot of people wanted to get in the Army or the Air Force because they got better conditions there than they got at home. Well, the food was, marginally better. You slept on your own where you might have been sleeping with your brothers, and you had a bathroom.
When I was about 18 all my friends was in the army. They kept on coming home on leave and saying what a good life it was. That's what made me join up. Because they was always on leave and I was always flogging it out.
All I thought we were fighting for was to stop the Jerrys coming over here and taking over this country, which I think they would have done. And I don't know what would have happened here then, or how many of us would have got, murdered, killed, slaughtered, whatever.
My brother was killed in the Air Force. He was a pilot, a flying officer, about 10 weeks before the end of the European War. And at that time, my calling up papers arrived. So I was conscripted into the army fairly quickly after he was killed. And it was a devastating time. I might say here that had I not been conscripted, I would have joined the army anyway, because the country was absolutely united. There was, apart from a few people with conscientious objection on religious or moral grounds, everybody played their part quite well.
I wouldn't have been a conscientious objector like a lot of them were. A lot of people were conscientiously rejected. I wouldn't do that. I couldn't do that. You know, if I had to go, I had to go.
England panicked in the last years of the war and took, let's say, anything they could find.
It was a very harsh experience for a lot of the recruits that came from the West Indies, because they came to a country that was, for them, particularly in the winter, cold, and they were not prepared for that.
When the young recruits first arrived in Britain, it was a shock in many ways. England was not what they expected. It was not a magical realm of splendid palaces and streets paved with gold.
I was so cold, you know, this is not for me. I want to go back to my sunshine. But then gradually, as you go along, you get used to whatever you come across, really. I expect that everybody here was very rich, you know, because, I mean, back in the Caribbean, we think that this is a place that it's like heaven, you know, but it wasn't what I thought it was when I came home.
We have never seen a country like this before. We have never seen snow before. Well, snow falling from the sky was something phenomenal. And if you have never seen snow before, those who are born and grown up in England, you should be taken for granted today. But in those days, it was something special.
There was a Jamaican who joined the RAF called Dudley Thompson, who explains this very, very well. That to be able to walk into a library anywhere in England, and there was no colour bar, you could pick up a book, you could read it, you could learn about the world. That was not possible in Jamaica, where he came from.
This side of the world now. Once you're black, you're from Africa. You know, how did you get into the services? Because in those days it was a big deal to be in the RAF as a native of this country. You know, it was a big deal to be in the RAF, and seeing your black face in the RAF uniform, they just couldn't come to terms. What was happening?
The first thing I noticed was all the laundries and everything were hanging up just like how you're washing in lines, just how we do in Africa and everything. And we found they can swear and do every kind of thing just like us. So they were friendly, and again the children were some of them were big, running barefoot.
And for the first time we saw these funny so-called white men with tattoos or crude-looking looks, because before, the so-called white people were respectable administrative officers or something like that. But overnight the island became a haven for survivors, these seamen from all over the world.
Within the services, however, most black volunteers were warmly welcomed, even if there was a great deal of ignorance and unfamiliarity on both sides.
In the beginning, when the war was on, we were gladly accepted by the population, because they feel that we had come to help them in their hour of need.
When their training is complete, they will go to aircraft or ordnance factories or machine shops. There are also others from several West Indian islands who volunteered and were chosen for their skill, and on arrival were immediately introduced into production in the united effort to beat Hitler and his gang.
And that's me there, what I look like, you see, when I was in the Air Force. And that's when I joined the Air Force, that's what I look like. You see, you can see how slim I look like. Down here you will see all my buddies that were in the training school. These are all our signatures when we say goodbye to each other before they sent us to different squadrons.
I joined the Royal Navy in 1941, and I served on the HMS Hawking, which was a minesweeper. And then in 1943 I transferred to the RAF, Air Sea Rescue Service, and I served on the rescue boats. At that time, the U-boats, the German U-boats, were very active in the Caribbean, and they were sinking the cargo ships and the oil tankers.
I did 8 weeks of training in Cardington. I learned how to march, I learned how to carry equipment, I learned to fire guns, I learned sorry to put it this way, you have to learn to shoot people.
I went to RAF Filey near Scarborough, Yorkshire. After about 2 months training, I became an aircraft engineer. If you have propeller-driven aircraft and it stops, you can still ring Sam King. Old-fashioned like Lancaster, Dakota, Spitfires, Hurricane, like that.
And there I was on a firing range, firing a gun. And, you know, from a Christian background, what am I doing here firing a gun on Good Friday?
There's always exceptions to the rule. We should never forget that it wasn't. Although discrimination and class distinctions went on, some would have broken through that, no matter how difficult it would have been.
Although war is on, although you're serving, but where promotion is concerned, you're always, you know, something is always missing that you're not able to be promoted. And the simple reason is it's very hard to come to conclusion, but they didn't want any black faces to be in charge, if possible. You know, it wasn't classified as racism at the time. You just had to accept there's nothing you could really do about it. There's nobody you could complain to, you know. And at the time, you thought more or less, oh well, you know, I'm here to do a job, so I might as well do it, you know, and don't think of it, because at that age you weren't politically aware of all these things happening.
Ulrich Cross, who is a hero and was highly decorated for his war work in the RAF, did manage to get promotion, but he was from a very educated middle-class Trinidadian background. Much harder if you were from a Jamaican farming family, for example.
In the Air Force, there was a very big contingent of chaps from the West Indies who wanted to get in the Air Force. Big, a lot of them. Not many came into the Army, because the Army was the worst of the three, Army, Air Force and Navy. The Army was the one down the bottom of the list.
When we look back, I mean, it is clear that Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister during the war, was an inspiring leader. They needed someone like that to help mobilise them, someone they could identify with, who was strong, outspoken. But then, as I've said in my own work, from interviews that I've found or done, that some of the black recruits that joined the RAF, for example, understood that Winston Churchill wasn't 100% for them being in the war. It was understood that black soldiers, black RAF personnel could not kill whites. That there was that kind of feeling. On the quiet, I think black people knew what Winston Churchill's views of them really were. He didn't want the islands to be decolonised after the war. It's kind of interesting that although people understood that he wasn't for black people, he wasn't for decolonisation, he was still an inspiring leader, and we should never sort of take that away from him.
During the war years, we in this country have seen many new faces, people from all parts of the British Commonwealth and Empire and from the Allied nations. When they are in the forces, we have learned to spot some of them. We know an Australian by his wide-brimmed hat, an Indian by his turban, a French sailor by his pom-pom and striped shirt. But when they are just dressed like anybody else, it is not so easy. What about these people, for example, who are making their way to Broadcasting House in London? Do you know what part of the world they come from? Are they from West Africa or the Union, from the Americas, or from some outlying island in the Pacific? Every one of these people gathered together in this studio is a West Indian. Every one has come across 4,000 miles of ocean from that great bay in the Atlantic which lies between North and South America. Today, West Indians have common citizenship and common cause with us, and they have come over to help us.
In the RAF, they were flying over the occupied territories, flying over Germany. They were in a very intense, life-threatening situation, so there was camaraderie, there was support for each other. It's not like the white RAF officers and personnel excluded the black one when they got into the plane. It wasn't like that. They worked together, they pulled together. It's not to say there wasn't discrimination in the RAF, there would have been instances, but when your back's against the wall, what's come over very clearly from some of the recruits that I spoke to, that they were like brothers in arms.
After training, the young black volunteers were given a variety of posts. Many were not in active service, mainly Royal Air Force ground crew.
This business of fear and fright of the Germans, or the guns and the bombs, eventually just fade away out of your mind, because you're trained to be there. So you're not looking behind you. You know you have support in your left, you have support in your right. But fear did not come into my mind.
In the Navy, you're on a ship and your family. So you more or less coordinate with each other. Because you know your survival depends on each other. And fortunately there wasn't much of us, just 6 of us Jamaicans. The rest were English and 1 or 2 Europeans. We had to fit in with each other. We were brothers because, you know, everybody life depended on each other.
At first, the surprise I had touched me that much because in our school days in Sierra Leone, we were taught to speak Oxford English, you understand? And their English was distinct, very distinct, you had to be clear. And others, they were the one that read the news, and they were the one that held all the positions, somehow. Well, eventually, in the end, when I met with them, I just don't know exactly whether I was talking to the Englishman or not. Because some of the accents were different. Some were called Jock, and some were called Taffy, and some were called different names. And their accents were so different that much. It took me some time to, I beg your pardon, I can't just understand what they were saying. But eventually one gets used to them when you mix with them. Then I managed to find that they were just exactly like us. You get, in West Africa, you get different tongues and different accents.
When we spoke among ourselves, Jamaican Pat or whatever things we and they didn't a lot of Englishmen in together, they didn't understand what he was saying. And sometimes they would ask them, what language you boys speaking? And I remember one friend of mine said, yeah, algebra. We got away with almost murder, you could say in some instances, you know.
The Air Force base in England had a lot of problems with the white troops, but most of all, West Indians, Jamaicans, and those from the Caribbean had problems with the white Americans.
Because they brought their racism, because at the time you had the white Americans and the black Americans, and the black Americans were treated awfully.
That was one of the biggest ironies of all, that we were fighting the Nazis, but fascism, if you like, was being practiced in some cases in Britain. There's many examples of that. It wasn't all, you know, we're bowing down to the wonderful Americans that have come. There was a lot of resistance to that kind of racism. Very, very interesting. And a lot of that come from the fact that the British people could see that the Americans were practicing the same kind of fascism that the Nazis were, which is what they were all supposed to be fighting about.
They were treated very, very, very badly until I think it was 1943 when the law came out that racism should be besieged the American forces. Until 1944 now, when things really got hot, you know, all that changed. And they started to bring infantry regiments, black Americans, to Germans to fight. We were more or less the protectors for the black Americans, you know, when they're on leave pass. For instance, we might be sitting in a pub, you know, black Americans, West Indians, girls, local girls, and you find 1 or 2 white Americans come to the door. Okay, nigger, get out of here, because they didn't like to see the white girls with the black guys.
It must have been very difficult to sustain that level of patriotism and support for the British war effort when you're not being allowed to go further than the more menial jobs.
The white population here didn't really get on well with them, and whenever we have any conflict, the population here was always on our side. Most of the women fighting and the men helping us.
I think it's a marvellous example of not what we expect when we look back through history, that these kind of villagers living in their lovely little cottages with the roses outside in this idyllic kind of world actually were fighting racism in the middle of the war. Good for them.
Being British, we were different from, although we look alike, but we had a different uniform on. And the white Americans soon realized, after a lot of scuffle and fight and things, they soon realized that the West Indians, although they look alike, they were different altogether.
We did have a crew on our squadron. The two gunners, one was a Chinaman and the other was an Englishman. And they were unlikely because now the Chinaman's name was Q, just QU. And the other gunner, his name was Fluck. Now you can imagine what that turned into, very simply, because that's what they were called, that crew. But they survived.
Racism was still an everyday part of British institutions.
In 1943, I think it was, when Leary Constantine, the Trinidadian cricketer who became during the war a welfare officer for the government, to mediate and help the West Indian workers that came to Britain. He was barred with his family from going into the Hotel Imperial in Russell Square in London. It was a policy because they were accommodating white American servicemen. They didn't realise who Leary Constantine was. He was just a black man. So he took it to court and won that case.
We are in just forces. We are a group together, a group of men together doing a job. When you're doing work collectively, you don't worry about your people's colour, because if Hitler drop a bomb, it has no colour in it. It kills everybody.
British Empire had the men who administered, and the men in Trinidad in the colonial days were all the top positions, or Englishmen or something like that. They knew nothing of us. They knew nothing of us at all. So even some of the senior flight sergeants or warrant officers, they honestly thought we lived in trees in Jamaica. And when we realized that they did, we kept it going. Said, yes, we live on a tall tree, and we will invite you for dinner. And if you come, when you're coming up the tree, we'll cut the ladder, and if you don't fall and break your foot, you're accepted. And it's unbelievable nonsense like that we used to get away with.
The question that they used to ask, if I live in trees, where did I learn English? How did I get in the RAF? Presently, I decided to re-educate them as much as I could.
There were not many West Indians in most camps. I think there was about 4 of us, 5 of us in most camps. But I was privileged. I worked with people from Norway to the Sudan. But Britain was at war, and they were glad to have us.
The aircraft are flying daily, nightly, and constantly flying, and you just got to get on with it. There was no place to hide, because when the Germans came over, they dropped bombs on you. You had to go to shelter. If you're brave enough, you would stay where you are and say, if you die, in my case, I say, if I die, so what?
The war was a testing time for many servicemen and women. It was distressing for some emotionally and physically.
I knew that we had lost of people. Coventry, London, Glasgow, Liverpool, and all the other British cities that had been bombed, and the thousands of British people that had been killed. Our object in mind was to win the war.
I went on a motorbike. I went with an officer there on another motorbike and a couple of DRs. They went, there's a Bren carrier in that field. We've got to go and drag it in. And it was a minefield, and we just went across this minefield. And when we got to this Bren carrier, I didn't know what death smelt like, but I just went, there's somebody dead here.
The crews get shut down in the channel or in it where we got to go and rescue them, before they freeze to death. All different jobs. You're steering, assisting in the rescue, So we had to defend ourselves at times. According to the count, we saved 18,000 lives over the period of war.
It was, as I said, you know, we were scared sometimes because when the searchlight come over and everyone the siren blowing, then we all have to be on our piano. Not that things were coming in, but you know, the searchlight, there was a searchlight that go around.
He was flying over Holland. They were attacked and the Lancaster literally blew up. He parachuted, luckily, it's amazing because the hatch didn't open apparently. So I think it was a last minute escape, and he came down in a field. He ended up in a prisoner of war camp. Yeah.
A quite famous one, actually.
I met Flight Lieutenant Cross twice personally and saw him a few times afterwards. He ended up as a squadron leader, and this is what I've heard, that he, I think I read it too, he bombed Germany 80-something times. He landed a bomber when the rest of the crew, I think a crew of 8, 5 of them were shot up. The pilot was dead, the co-pilot, the gunners, and he was the navigator air bomber.
I watched all the troops come in at Arnhem, and I watched the gliders come in, and I watched the Germans shooting them as they jumped out of the gliders. I saw so many people got killed like that. You got no chance.
I was one of those who was servicing the aircraft. They loaded up the aircraft with men, with guns and bombs and so forth, and flew down on them. Unfortunately, on that day, the weather changed. The German got hints that the British forces were going to land and capture that part of Holland, and they were waiting for them, and they just massacred them. Thousands, hundreds of soldiers died that weekend. I was here in England. Very few got back alive, and that's the nature of war.
But I had a chap the side of me, and he was about 45, come from up north, and he was crying his eyes out, and he couldn't get his fingers into the ground far enough because he kept saying he was going to get killed. Well, that made you scared while you were sitting there, you know what I mean? It made you frightened. But those people got called up at the same time as me. They were 45 years, 40, 45. They were expected to do the same thing as me.
When one's sitting in one turret and is on operations, and you're flying at anything between 14 to 20,000 feet, it is cold. Over Europe it could get down to easy -40 centigrade. And it wouldn't be unusual from your oxygen mask, little icicles hanging down from condensation that froze up. You were searching the skies. You were looking for other aircraft, friend or foe. Mostly if you found a foe, well, you could take evasive action. So there it was, you just sat there and you searched the sky.
For servicemen and women on leave, there were lighter moments. Some even found romance with white women.
I don't think there was any difference between the black servicemen and the white servicemen in terms of what they did during their leave. They would go off and visit famous British landmarks that would come to London. Dr. Harold Moody and his League of Coloured Peoples organised quite a number of days for the West Indian workers, whether they be in the factories or servicemen.
Life was tough because if you married a white woman, you had to look after yourself. You might be attacked or you might be injured or something might happen to you as a black man because there was still hidden racism in the country.
Love is blind. Some of them would give their lives for their boyfriend or for their husband. I nearly married a girl, Betty, from Victoria, Nottingham. But funny enough, my English family thought I should marry a girl from Victoria because my parents had written to them and says that we're not too bad, we have a few acres. But no, love is blind. She married somebody else. She married a fellow from Guildford, sorry. So that's that.
I personally did not make color as important at the time. I just saw it another woman. But probably the members of the public saw it differently, because you probably go out with a white girl, you take her to the pictures, because in those days that's the only place to take her to movies. You know, just cheap, and that's what we could afford. But one didn't see it special as a special thing to do. And white girls weren't seen as something special other than black women, because as I said before, there are not a lot of black women over here until after the days of the Windrush.
And we used to have some really marvellous times. And you wouldn't think that, would you, during the war? But you do, you forget all your worries and everything when you get, you know, into a sort of situation where you can have a lovely dance and have a jump around and forget everything else that worries you. And that's how we were. And I must admit, the Jamaicans were really a nice lot of guys. Really lovely, eh? It was at a little place in Nottingham, you know, where all the West Indians used to get in this little place. We used to do a lot of jitterbugging and jiving. And I met Laurie, and straight away we got together, we knew how to dance together, it was lovely. So that's when the jitterbugging was all going mad, you know, it was lovely. You know, and Laurie and I were so well matched, it was lovely.
Eventually the war ended and many servicemen and women found themselves in the limbo of demobilisation.
Now, one of the greatest experiences my father told me about was when he was in Trafalgar Square on Armistice Day. He said the joy and the elation of the people at the relief of finally the end of the war, and everybody was just rejoicing, and they were so grateful to the Commonwealth soldiers for coming here and stuffing their pockets with money. They got a lot of money that day, those who were around Trafalgar Square and in the square.
You just came back and you carried on doing what you were doing prior to going in the forces and whatever. And that was 5.5 years with me, like, you know, when I came back, and it was, to me, it wasn't a lot of change. All I got was like somebody telling me after, like, you know, so-and-so got killed, and that's it. I think it was a good job we stopped him. I suppose it was done me a bit of good going in the army. Probably calmed me down a bit, because you didn't know what you were going to see or what happened. When I went, I didn't think I was going to get killed.
Women were expected to go back to the kitchen. Black recruits, if they were from the West Indies, go back. African recruits go back once that uniform came off.
Most West Indians and Africans were returned home. Frequently, life back in the colonies was just as difficult as it had been before the war.
I went home 1946, was demobbed. I got a job in Jamaica, but unfortunately they weren't expecting us to come back, and nothing was done for our rehabilitation because the British government thought it was the responsibility of the Jamaican government.
What I would say, and it's a very important point, is that in 1945 the British public needed and desperately wanted to go back to pre-war, what they perceived as pre-war normality. The rose-covered cottage, the kind of idyllic England that they had been fed before the war. That did not include black people, but neither did it include, let's be fair, women, British women who had come out of the home and worked in the factories and joined the services.
And around that time, we heard that England was in the stage of rebuilding, and we thought more or less that if we came back to England, we would stand a chance to get a job and to start a life.
Once again, Britain sent out an appeal to the West Indies. This time it was an invitation for workers to help rebuild the nation. The former troop ship, the Empire Windrush, carried almost 500 mostly black returnees to Britain from the Caribbean in June 1948.
First and foremost, of course, is the long-term policy that ultimately will have to be adopted. And that is the development of the West Indies themselves, because that is the only answer.
My parents came to England, like I think a lot of other Caribbean parents did. They came because England wanted help. And that's why I've always said, you know, Britain has never had a more loyal citizen than the people from the Caribbean. And we came over here to help. And a lot of people who had good qualifications end up on the buses. That was the other side. And they said, well, we're going to go to England, we're going to stay for 5 years or 10 years, and then we're going to go back because we were helped enough by them. But we're still here. And second, third, fourth generations are still here. So that's what's happened.
I'm still here because I thought I was only going to stay for 5 years. And I'm here much longer. I'm here for donkey years now. I've spent more years in this country than the country where I was born.
Yeah, the Empire Windrush brought the first wave of post-war settlers. It was a recruitment drive. It was a recruitment drive in the Caribbean for mainly men, but some women, to fill the jobs that the British didn't want. The lower paid jobs, because a lot of the British people after the war wanted a better life as well.
The big change was when the Windrush came. That was what was the beginning of changes, because the government realized that they had to do something. They had to do something positive.
When the immigrant people started coming here, you've got to bear in mind in 1946 we were in a new era of educational, scientific, cultural changes. And those people came in and made some of those changes.
We were grateful to them. I don't think that, of course, the governments showed their gratitude too much towards anybody or to any of us in particular. But because we accepted them as what they were, there was never any problems. They were your mate. You buy him a pint, he'd buy you a pint.
Some of the English people, I was blessed. A friend of mine took me to their home in Nottingham, Bulwell, and they took me as one of their own because I was in uniform. And people were reasonable.
Some of the black volunteers were more highly skilled than their English counterparts.
At first, a lot of people assumed if you were from the colony, you couldn't, but in many cases I was a technical person and some of them were not. So you had to accept, they had to accept that.
I was able to actually come to England, and as soon as you came to England, the first thing they gave you was, because of your certificate and your training, don't worry, you got a big job straight away in the engineering field.
By the time the settlers came after the war, through the 1950s, they were not welcomed in the way they felt they should have been, partly because of what they and their families had done for the war and their islands had done for the war. And I think that is one of the great tragedies of post-war Britain, that we didn't remember and we didn't use that wartime experience of black people in the war as a way of preparing the British public for this post-war, multicultural, culturally diverse country that we've now become.
I've just come into this country. I'm from all over the show. It's probably a better living over here, more money over here, jobs over here. And how they're coming. But I think we're just letting too many people come in. Because we haven't got the houses, we haven't got the work, we haven't got whatever.
In 1950, there was a ad says room to let. I went to Stockwell where it was. I took a man. When I got there, it says no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Very hurtful.
And that they got away with that for a time. Of course, it's not until very recent years that the law took a stand against that kind of thing.
But it was a blessing. We had to buy property, resulting that if you bought a 3-bedroom house in Brixton Hill for $2,500 in 1950, today it's $500,000.
In politics, far-right racist individuals and groups exploited the post-war tensions.
Mosley wanted a white race popularity only. He was a prejudiced, a glory seeker. Same as Hitler. We laughed it off as kids. You used to go around the streets afterwards. I'm in the black gang, you know, I'm a Mosley. We knew about Mosley. I mean, we went round there. East London, round the docks and that.
Disgusting. Disagree entirely.
The British Union of Fascists have adopted Nazi symbolism. Just 18 days after this rally, the British Union of Fascists outlawed.
Those young men and women who were once war heroes and welcome volunteers had become immigrants. And they were not always welcome.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
You actually have politicians like Enoch Powell saying things like, there's too many black people here and they should all know where they come from. So, and in fact, that's not long after you had legislation to reduce the number of black people coming to this country.
A fifth or a quarter of such towns and cities as Wolverhampton, Birmingham, and inner London will, in course of time, consist of the Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. There has been no attempt at refutation.
The politicians start to more or less stir up the public, because people felt that you came here, the immigrants came here to take away their jobs and everything.
They couldn't get white people to do it, so I mean, what was the objection? The only thing that struck me was these chaps turned up with big, huge trilby hats and what they called zoot suits, I think, down to their knees. And of course they spoke in their own lingo. That's always irritating.
The normal, you know, I don't like you niggers, that's easier to deal with. Come around the back and we deal with it. The other ones where you think you are accepted because you're carrying the Queen's crown in your head and you cannot advance any further, that's the one that hurts.
So really, that's an inborn, that's the thing that was, I suppose, is in society in a way. You don't want them, you don't want those, and it manifested itself then.
Occasionally, racial tensions would explode into street violence.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain. In Notting Hill Gate, only a mile or two from London's West End, racial violence. An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer shop, while police reinforcements are called up to check the riot. One of many that have broken out here in a few days.
Unbelievable, but yeah, this is what's happening in England. You have routine racist attacks against black people. So what happens in Notting Hill in 50 is that the black people decide to fight back as a group. And what's interesting about that fight back is that it includes a lot of veterans.
My friends were mostly ex-servicemen and they could handle themselves. And they got organized. And as soon as they got organized and started now to fight back, it suddenly went quiet. They got machetes and everything handy. They were, you know, they were well prepared to fight back. And once the Teddy boys realized that they were against opposition, it just disappeared.
So that was an indication of then what was to come.
They had parades and meetings and all that to start to say the government should send back all these blacks to the country where they come from.
The generation of black arrivals were greeted with suspicion and resentment.
There's also the campaign in '64 up in Smethwick, let's go Smethwick, and the slogan for that campaign was, if you want an N-word for Neighbour, vote Labour. N-word is N-I-G-G-E-R, right? And this was the campaign, and he won. This is Peter Griffin rather. And he won it in 64 with that slogan. So if that was happening in 64, 68 is only 4 years down the line, and it was worse. It was the same. It was a big deal. It was a major problem. That kind of legitimized racism.
Where do you intend to put the coloured people who can't get houses in Marshall Street?
Well, that isn't our problem. That is the problem of the immigrant himself.
This delegation to the council was purely to try and make a stand to stop the road completely being taken over by coloured people.
Things and times has changed, because I can remember the days I went to Brixton. This is going back about 1947. And I'll walk around Brixton looking for another black face. And when I tell people that, they say, oh, how old are you? But this happened in 1947. And the whole world has changed with independence and everything.
And I was in fights, you had the situation of the Teddy Boys when it's beat you up. You had the National Front as well, So physically, I developed very quickly. And instead of using your head to deal with the situation, I used my fists. And that would deal with it very rapidly.
Now, you claim in this manifesto of yours that within 50 years, well before 50 years, indigenous British people will be in a minority in this country. Can you define indigenous, please?
Yeah, English, Scots, Irish, Welsh, people who've been here overall, in fact, their ancestry for thousands of years.
I'm trying to get what you define as a true British person.
It's anyone who effectively is so melded into the majority English-British population that nobody knows, nobody cares.
So the matter of their skin colour is neither here nor there?
No, that is, because one of the symptoms of being English or Scottish or Irish or Welsh is being what the BBC would call white. There's two meanings to British. There's the civic sense and there's the ethnic sense. Right. Ethnically, you cannot be English if you're Chinese, for instance, obviously. But someone who's perhaps been born here, whose parents came here from the West Indies 40, 50 years ago, of course, civically, they are British, but ethnically, they're not.
We're all born under this flag. We was all born under this flag. And we'll live in this flag. And if you stop this flag, what happens next? Which flag's next?
Some guys get actually, I don't know, I would say, suckered into it, because they're just told, well, that's it, they're taking your jobs, all the rest of it, and then you've got the likes of whoever the leader is, he's always on there spouting, he's spouting poison and such, and generally he would be off to these poor areas in the Midlands, places like that where there's very little work.
Multiculturalism, the legacy of the Windrush generation, is under attack by politicians at the highest level.
We've allowed the weakening of our collective identity. Under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream. We've failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. We've even tolerated these segregated communities behaving in ways that run completely counter to our values. So when a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't white, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful, to stand up to them.
People have realized that that can't work, because Britain, let's face it, is a multicultural society that we live in today, whether you want to accept it or not. And under the multicultural system, things have to change.
Acceptance of West Indians by some British people was not always forthcoming.
By accident, I became the mayor of Southwark in 1983. I was always active in the community, and they said I should become a councillor. I became a councillor, and I knew about housing. And after about 6 months as a councillor in Southwark, they said they're going to make me the mayor of Southwark next year. When I went home, my wife was in bed, I said, Mother, these people are silly. They said they're going to make me the mayor of Southwark next year. She said, Sam, you've got no ambition. You could be anything if you wanted. And next year they made me the mayor of Southwark. The National Front about 2 weeks before I was to be mayor, let it be known that if Sam King becomes the mayor of Southwark, they're going to slit my throat and burn down my house. My reply was, I'm a Christian. I'm not against them slitting my throat, but they should not burn down my house because it's not a council house. And give the newspaper their due. Even the Daily Mail had 2 inches in the front page. This man volunteered during the war and they made him the mayor of Southwark. Who should say he shouldn't be the mayor?
I joined the JDF, the Jamaica Defence Force, in 1980 as an officer cadet, and I was selected to do my basic officer training at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst.
For a century and a half, the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst has produced the subalterns to officer and empire. But in the past few years, the British Army's role has changed radically, and with it the Sandhurst system.
Now, coming from Jamaica, there has always been a history of Jamaican cadets doing well at Sandhurst. The cadets that come from overseas would come primarily from other Caribbean countries, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, Thailand, okay? So for me, and I was also fortunate that there was 3 of us at the same time at Sandhurst. So when I met the white cadets and they heard that I was from Jamaica, they sort of met me and the other cadets there with a bit of respect. The training was hard and arduous, but being trained as potential leaders, I think that the experience I had with them is that they treated me as an equal.
A serviceman lives a very hard life, a very difficult life. To those who live in a cushioned society today, it's a far wicked life to be a serviceman.
I'm Merwin Eversley. I was born in Barbados and came here in '65. That was the thing in the 60s. You know, a lot of Caribbean folk came here, and if they had children, obviously they couldn't afford to bring them with them, a lot of them, so they left them with their parents, and then came here, worked, and then saved enough money to send for their children. In the Falklands, I served with like the 2nd Battalion and the Parachute Regiment A Company. I was trained as a soldier, and basically it's either you or the other guy. In those terms, when you're there, and you're open fire on, that's it, you either fire back and keep their head down, or else you'll be coming home in a body bag, basically. What actually happened, I think, because when I came here as a British citizen from Barbados, because Barbados was still a colony, I was here for about a year or so, and in 67, Barbados got independence, so therefore I'd ceased to become a British citizen, apparently, and I was actually serving in the military at the time, and I think Zola Budd had come over and the BBC had paid for her, or one of the companies had paid for her citizenship and all the rest of it, and I'd applied for mine, and they said to me, oh well no, sorry, you're no longer entitled to it and you have to pay. So I offered them my medals and said, well, they're worth whatever, and I just decided, well, if I'd have been killed, you wouldn't have sort of like draped a Barbados flag over my coffin, so why should I have to pay for my citizenship? And in fact I sold my medals, and then that paid for my citizenship. I was a bit angry at the time. I thought, well, it's okay for Miss Budd to turn up because she was, but I suppose it was because she was white South African, and the paper, or the Daily Mail or whatever, could pay for her to have her citizenship done. And where is she now? So I don't really need them. I know I earn my medals. The lads I served with know I earned my medals or whatever, so I don't really need them.
I think when you join the army, you don't really realise the full potential of what signing on the dotted line meant. I think we thought it was a case of, yes, you're going to have a certain amount of discipline, you're going to learn to shoot, etc., etc. But the other side is when you go to place of conflict and people are trying to kill you. When we was in Ireland, the IRA put up on the wall, do not shoot the blacks, they are oppressed enough in England. So all the black shouts were saying, fucking hell, they're not shooting at you lot. And I said, listen, just go away. A bullet does not differentiate between black and white, so don't be stupid. when you actually see parts of people, you know, when you've got to shoot at people, you know, within yourself, you know, you lose something, you know, and I think a lot of soldiers cry out for forgiveness for what they've done or what they are about to do due to the circumstances they face.
It's an education to go in the army, it was. But I wouldn't advise anybody to go in now, because they send you straight to Afghanistan and you get killed in about 6 weeks.
It is psychologically quite damning when you have to look between your sights and there's somebody in those sights and you have to pull the trigger. It is not a very nice thing to do. And you know, when I never forget when I had come back from a particular place and I had to take Mummy shopping and a car backfired and I rolled over and I went behind. And remember, I'm in Civilian Street and she goes, "Son, what's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, it's okay, Mummy, nothing." And I said to some of my army guys that I thought that any soldier who've been on active service, who have come under fire, who have had to return fire, should not be allowed out of the army for at least 2 years, maybe 3 years, depending on the severity of where he's been, because it's in your conscious, subconscious or whatever, it's in there. In Ireland, I have to say the IRA is a very good firm. They're not stupid people, and they're fighting for a cause. And I never forget when I was talking to certain people, and I said, an army fighting for a salary will never beat an army fighting for a cause. First of all, we had to get naturalized, which is a major issue. You know, you fought for the country, some people have died, and we weren't British citizens. You know, I don't understand, I will never understand how that happened and how the government allowed it to happen, because for that £70, a lot of goodwill was lost.
Yeah, it made me feel like an immigrant, which I am, you know, and I was an immigrant.
Eventually, the personal qualities shown by the first wave of Windrush arrivals saw them through. They brought much richness and diversity to British culture.
Music, politics, athletics are just some of them, and that has fed into British society to make it better, more richer.
I've 1 or 2 black friends I know. Yeah, they've got as much cheek as me.
Well, I come from a singing family because Eva Wilmot is a singer, and I decided to try my luck singing in the clubs, which I was a bit successful, because at that time anything was American, any entertainment, black entertainment was American, and I survived for a while until a friend of mine got the idea to form a group, a singing group, and that's where I more or less took off.
Come on, try again. Come on. That's better. I love you so. Kokomo!
Thank you very much, the Southlanders.
Spirituals, rhythm and blues, because that was the thing at the time. That was before Calypso. Calypso came onwards, but that didn't last. That Calypso collapsed. We had a hit in Germany, and we used to do a lot of shows in Germany, most of the American bases, and our hit record was played all over the continent. I always wanted a car, and this was my first royalty check that I bought this car with, which was quite a scene at the time, because seeing a black guy driving a convertible, you know, was something unusual.
He made his breakthrough really, I think, on Tonight, which was a
in the
program.
60s.
that was, yeah, late 50s, early 60s, where he sang a topical calypso.
Every night.
Things he said turned the faces red. He suggested American blood be shed. The briefest comment to date was the president's round of 108. We bring you the news you ought to know in tonight's topical calypso.
He didn't say much about it. He was always saying that the prejudice here is hidden away. He was the first sort of black person on telly. He started acting, and then he got a small part with Laurence Olivier to go to New York. Caesar and Cleopatra with Vivien Leigh. I mean, he had the littlest parts holding a spear. You know how they did it, a black guy. He was sort of in front of Vivien Leigh, who didn't like it. You know.
Still no word from Commodore Goddard's plane since they hit that freak storm, sir.
He was Lieutenant Green in Captain Scarlet. And yeah, that was actually something to his the royalties of that one kept him happy for quite a while. Described himself as an angry black man who had suffered prejudice in this country, and even though we all thought, you know, he was always so well regarded, there was always people in our house, he was fan mail, and you know, I never saw that side, but he obviously felt it hugely.
It's changed gradually, hasn't it? I mean, it didn't happen all of a sudden, you know, it happened gradually. But you see, as you go through the times and people look at you and say, oh, you know, look at that, you get used to it and you just ignore it. And as time went by, people seem to accept you in certain circles, and then you get going to different places. People accept you. Now when they hear Laurie talk about different things, they know that he's not an ignorant person. It's the same as what they are, it's just that he's got a brown face instead of a white face.
Organisations such as the West Indian Association of Service Personnel, WASP, and the Royal British Legion have helped raise public awareness of the role these men and women have played.
One of the concerning matters arising now, which is coming to our awareness, is that there are a number of ex-servicemen and women that are homeless, are struggling to settle back into society here. And in fact, there are some who have served, have left the army and have now been told that they need to go home.
Many ex-military are on the street, numbers of them now, and even after the war. People are taken apart to train as soldiers. Their whole thinking, their mind is rejigged, and they become killing machines in a sense, because that's what you have to do. And some of the experiences that they've had have really traumatized them, and therefore when they come back, they leave the military service, they are just not together. They find it very hard to settle. Everything is done for them. They don't have to pay a bill. They don't have to worry about where they live. They don't have to worry about what they eat, you know. And so here they are. They've been demobbed. They're back in Civil Street, and they're like, what do I do now? And they end up on the streets. They end up as alcoholics. They end up as drug addicts. And I've done a lot of work over the years and found many ex-military men who have gone through that, and worked to get them off the street and worked to put them in homes.
WASP is a very good organisation. Its past and its objects have had to change, primarily because society is changing, the theatre is changing of war, the needs of the country is changing. We now have more service personnel coming from the Caribbean. And to that end, whereas before you may be looking at accommodation or welfare and so forth, you're now looking towards post-traumatic stress, you know, disablement, you know, the economic development of the ex-servicemen, woman. So it's changed, WASP has changed, and it's evolved into this new organization that is looking to provide the needs for our service personnel as they come back.
Yes, after a while they realize that they have to be recognized, because everybody receive recognition beside the West Indians and the African and the Indian ex-servicemen.
In 2002, the Commonwealth Memorial Gates in London were unveiled. These gave belated recognition to the 5 million volunteers from the Indian subcontinent, Africa and the Caribbean who fought for Britain. A visit to the Seaford Memorial Centre in East Sussex has become an annual pilgrimage for WASP to honour fallen black servicemen.
Welcome to you all, honoured guests, friends. We gather here today to remember those who lie at peace in this cemetery, those who live locally, those who lived at some distance, and those who came from far away. They all answered the call, but some were destined never to return to their homes. It was likely on a day such as this, they were laid at rest.
In commemoration of those who gave their lives, I do take this privilege to plant the tree in memory of their lives. Thank you. Those of our brothers and sisters who died in the service of the nation, and to this end, may God bless all those who died. May we live as long as possible to give fair respect to our comrades. I thank
The Australian Canadians here now, you know, they bury them here. You see, I'm saying back home. So people back home don't know that the folks didn't come back. No one told them. Just Scotland didn't tell us that some of our boys buried there. The government didn't tell us. Oh, now our government didn't tell us.
In November 2012, black ex-servicemen and women proudly marched together on Remembrance Sunday. They had successfully campaigned to be included.
My dad came here on the Windrush a very long time ago, and he was one of the first invited ex-servicemen back to this country. They came on a ship, they used to call it a banana boat. From what I gathered from what my dad used to tell me, that you know, they never really liked some of the treatment that some of the ex-servicemen got. And although there's nothing been done, like anybody stepping forward to make an official apology, I think that it's about time that people sort of realise that this is an international thing, that lots of people from the Caribbean contributed their time and money and their own lives in helping with the war.
In September 2012, WASP held its second annual March Past in Brixton, South London, that went to Windrush Square. West Indian servicemen and women, veterans, serving members of the military, cadets and firefighters took part.
The Jamaica Ex-Soldiers Association, which we represent all the ex-soldiers in this country.
Left, right.
I want to pay tribute to those who came from far and wide, because without their help, both currently and in the past, the forces of the United Kingdom alone would never have been able to manage to fight the First and Second World Wars. Are sick, who can't be here today. I'm proud to see that young people are getting involved.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them all together. We will remember them.
Day. 70 years ago, this year, my father left this country to train as an RAF pilot in America, and when he came back 18 months later, he was joined by lots of West Indian servicemen coming over to fight for their country in the Second World War. And that history stays with us and leads us into our future. It's a huge honour for me to be the borough commander of police in this magnificent borough, the borough where my father was born. And it is a wonderful thing for me to stand here today in front of you and watch and see how you are taking your legacy forward.
To have our own memorial to service personnel approximately 10 meters from where I'm standing. We have to go through planning permission, which is a process, because we intend to have this memorial as a tribute to our contribution for hundreds of years from now. So when our children are here to commemorate what we've done, at least they will be able to say they were there.
It is gradually happening, but there are certain things that don't happen suddenly. It takes a matter of time. There's nothing you can do about it to be in a hurry.
It's an experience to actually bridge the gap between the two cultures, because now, like my children, they put tomato ketchup on rice and peas, you know, which is a sacrilege, you know, but it's something that you can see how the two cultures are trying to mix together.
I was born and raised. I lived in Britain. I fought for Britain, and I'm proud to be British.
People, they say that because we're black, we're not allowed in this country, but they don't know all of their past history. People from their family could be black, because my great-granddad is a white person.
What's happened now is we have young people who are, to a certain degree, disenfranchised in terms of, are they Caribbean, are they African, you know, or are they British, you know. In my house, I would carry a Jamaican flag, a British flag, an African flag, and a European flag, because that's effectively what we've always become.
No 2 person or 3 or 4 person has got the same heart and soul, and you find that because one is do you a harm from a country that you don't care for, you're going to say everybody's the same thing. That's what they say about Jamaicans, but you can't follow that up. What we've got to do is challenge these type of distinctions, discrimination.
I don't think there's been sufficient recognition for black people and their effort in the war. I think my dad made it his final mission, actually. There's now a website for logging all the black Caribbean air crew that fought. And I think it's only now that maybe people are becoming aware, slightly, not hugely, that black people even fought for this country.
One of the things that really concerns me is that after 70 years, we still do not recognise the contribution that black people made to the war, both on the home front and in the services.
Now you learned something that people haven't learned in my home.